The sound cracked across the third floor of the Ambrose Hotel, and every person in that marble hallway stopped moving at once. A violin case hit the floor. The strings inside it cried out one broken note that didn't belong to any song. The young woman didn't fall. She bent forward, brought 2 fingers to the corner of her mouth, and when she pulled them away, there was blood on her fingertips. Sergeant Roy Kessler straightened up, breathing hard, his palm still burning. All those years behind that badge had taught him exactly what came next. She'd apologize. She'd look at the floor. She'd let him open that case. Instead, she lifted her head and looked him straight in the eye. And there wasn't any fear in it at all. Behind her, the heavy walnut doors of Grand Hall 302 swung open from the inside. The man who came through them wore a black 3-piece suit. And there were people in South Philadelphia who'd tell you that in all the years they'd known him, nobody had ever seen Cosimo Santangelo raise his voice. And nobody, not once, had ever seen him run. He ran 3 steps. Then he stopped, and something crossed his face and shut down behind his eyes. And Kessler felt the cold reach him before he understood why. Santangelo went down on one knee on the marble. He lifted the violin case upright with both hands, the way a man lifts a sleeping child. He took the handkerchief from his breast pocket and held it out. And she took it the way people take something they've been handed 100 times before. Then he stood and turned and looked at the sergeant with an expression so calm it made the whole hallway feel like it was tilting. And he said 4 words in the flattest voice anyone there had ever heard. He said, "You hit my wife. If a story like this one moves you, tap that like button so it can reach more people. Share it with somebody who'd want to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel, because there's a new one waiting for you every week." Now let's go back to 4 o'clock that morning, hours before any of this, and meet the woman who was about to walk into that hotel carrying her mother's violin. 4 o'clock in the morning in North Philadelphia was an hour only people without choices ever learned to live with. Imani Rowe opened her eyes before the old clock on top of the refrigerator had a chance to ring, as she'd done for so many years, and lay still a little longer in the darkness, listening to her son's breathing on the other side of the thin wall. The apartment had only 2 rooms, and was so small that she could reach out from where she lay and touch the doorframe. But she'd lived in far worse places. Places where she hadn't dared sleep deeply. Places where all her belongings fit inside a single bag kept beside the bed in case she needed to leave. She sat up, pulled the blanket over her son's chest, and stood looking at the boy for a moment. Amari slept on his side with one hand still wrapped tightly around a little green plastic soldier. And in his dreams, he was laughing, the breathy laughter children make when they dream of something terribly funny that they won't remember in the morning. Imani bent down and kissed his forehead very gently, then left the room and closed the door behind her. In the kitchen, she switched on the small light above the sink, the only light she dared use at that hour. An envelope lay on the table. It had been there for days. One corner curled upward, the paper inside folded and unfolded so many times that it had gone limp as cloth, its creases worn white. The name of an insurance company was printed on the envelope, along with a small line stating that this was the final notice. Imani picked it up, felt the softness of the paper beneath her fingers, then set it down again. She didn't open it and read it another time. She knew every line by heart, knew them so well that on some nights, she could lie with her eyes closed and still see the words inside her mind, and she understood perfectly that reading them once more wouldn't make any of those words change. She heated water, made a cup of weak tea, and drank it standing beside the sink, because sitting down would cost her more time when she had to rise again. Then she turned toward the corner of the room, where her mother's violin had stood beneath a cloth cover for all those years. She pulled the cloth away. The black case was so old that its outer fabric had faded to gray wherever hands had touched it most often. Its brass clasps had tarnished, and there was a dent in the lower right corner that had become so familiar she no longer noticed it. She laid the case on the floor, opened both clasps, and lifted the lid. Inside, tucked neatly beneath the neck of the violin, was a small pair of yellow wool socks, clumsily folded into a square in the way only a child's hands could manage. Imani sank to the kitchen floor. She picked up the socks and held them in her palm, and for one moment, she couldn't breathe. The previous evening, the boy had asked where she was taking the violin in the morning, and she'd told him she needed it for something. He'd nodded as though he understood, then quietly done this without saying a word to her. Because in the mind of a child, the violin needed a companion so it wouldn't be lonely. She sat there for a long time on the cold tile floor, with both hands closed around those little socks, refusing to let herself cry, because if she cried at 4 o'clock in the morning, the entire day would fall apart. And today was a day when she had no right to let anything fall apart. At last, she placed the socks on the kitchen table beside the envelope and closed the violin case. When she opened the apartment door, Mrs. Delphine from across the hall was already standing outside in her robe, holding a ring of keys, because she rose early too, and for years the two women had shared an unspoken arrangement. "Leave the door open a little," she said, her eyes lowered toward the violin case. "I'll come over at 7 o'clock and make the boy breakfast." Imani nodded and thanked her. Mrs. Delphine was silent for a moment, then asked whether anyone was going with her that day, and Imani only smiled. The smile of someone who had grown accustomed to that question a very long time ago, ever since she was 18 years old, and walked through the gates of her final foster home, carrying one bag and without a single telephone number to call. "No," she said, "there never has been." Then she carried her mother's violin down the stairs, out of the building, and into the lingering cold of a Saturday morning that hadn't yet begun to brighten. A few miles away, downtown, the Ambrose Hotel had been awake long before the sun touched the rooftops of the buildings surrounding it. Sergeant Roy Kessler entered through the staff door at 6 o'clock, carrying a cup of coffee he'd bought at a gas station, and wearing the expression of a man being forced to do something he considered beneath him. The off-duty security shift at the hotel wasn't his primary job, but it paid cash and it was easy, and he'd stopped distinguishing between those two things a long time ago. At the front desk, a young employee was straightening a stack of menus when he accidentally sent Kessler's coffee sliding across the polished stone counter. Before the young man could apologize, Kessler had already finished speaking one sentence. Only one, delivered in a voice quiet enough that no one in the lobby could hear but sharp enough to leave the employee frozen in place, both ears burning red, and too afraid to look toward the hallway for the rest of the morning. Kessler continued walking without looking back. He didn't need to look. He already knew what the reaction would be, because he'd seen it many times before, on many different faces, throughout all the years he'd worn that uniform. In the basement security room, he removed a body camera from its charging rack, glanced at the small indicator light blinking orange, then clipped it to his chest with the careless motion of a man fastening a button. The orange light meant the battery wasn't fully charged. He knew that. He also knew that sometime around the middle of the shift, it would shut itself off, as it always did, and he would write the same line in the duty log that he'd written so many times before, that the equipment had suffered a technical malfunction. No one had ever asked another question. No one had ever wanted to. Standing a few steps away was Tessa Vaughn, who had been assigned to work with him that morning, still young, still wearing a uniform so crisp that anyone could tell she hadn't been wearing it for long. She saw the orange light. She also saw the way he clipped the camera to his shirt. She said nothing. During the first few months after graduating from the academy, she'd spoken up, and she'd learned very quickly that speaking made everything difficult in ways no one ever explained to her, while silence allowed everything to continue as it always had, and allowed her to keep her job. So she remained silent, and she hated that silence in herself more than she hated him, though she'd never admitted it to anyone. Around the middle of the morning, something happened. A guest on the 4th floor called the front desk to report that her diamond bracelet was no longer inside her jewelry box. She said she was certain, in the voice of someone who had never been required to feel certain about anything in her life, and said she wanted someone to handle the matter immediately. The manager on duty went upstairs to the room, came back down, then found Kessler in the 1st floor hallway, and spoke to him in a lowered voice. The hotel was hosting a major event that day. Guests had already begun arriving in the upper hall. Management didn't want sirens, didn't want a report, and didn't want anything that might cause the guests in suits and evening gowns to turn their heads and look. He told Kessler to handle the matter discreetly, then repeated the word discreetly once more to make certain, and walked away. Kessler stood there with the cold coffee in his hand, nodding, while inside his mind, those words had already transformed into something entirely different. To him, discreetly didn't mean carefully. It meant no one was watching. He finished the last swallow of coffee, threw the cup into the trash, and started up the stairs, because he already had the same thought he always had whenever someone told him something had gone missing. He wasn't looking for an object. He was looking for a person. And on the 3rd floor, Tessa Vaughn followed several steps behind him, one hand gripping the strap of her duty belt, still silent as she'd always been silent, with no idea that this was the final morning she would still be able to remain that way. At the far end of the 3rd floor, behind the walnut doors of Grand Hall 302, A meeting had begun before the hotel had time to fill with people. Seated around the long table draped in white were the organizers of the fundraising gala, the people responsible for the invitations, those overseeing the auction, 2 representatives from the hospital foundation, and at the end of the table, in the chair closest to the door, a man in a black 3-piece suit quietly reading the list of items that would be offered for sale that evening. Cosimo Sant'Angelo always sat there. In every room he entered, he chose the chair nearest the exit, and he did it so naturally that even he no longer noticed, the way a person no longer notices breathing. Aurelio Marchetti, who had sat beside him for more years than most of the people in that room had been alive, had once joked that it was the habit of men who lived a long time, and Cosimo had answered only that his father had sat with his back to a door exactly once in his life. After that, no one joked about where he sat again. He was there that morning because he'd paid every expense involved in organizing the gala, and because each year he came to tell the same people the same thing. The printed program would include the names of the sponsors, the hospital, the doctors, and the people who had donated the auction items, but his name wasn't to appear on a single line. The communications director, a young woman newly hired that season, carefully explained that having a prominent name behind the event would increase donations considerably, that people usually opened their wallets wider when they saw someone else had opened theirs first. Cosimo listened until she finished without interrupting once, then shook his head and said that if his name appeared, the evening would no longer belong to the children, it would belong to him. The young woman didn't fully understand what he meant, but she nodded, and she would understand before that day was over. It happened near the end of the meeting, when a waitress entered carrying a fresh pitcher of water and accidentally set it down a little too hard, sending several drops onto the edge of the documents belonging to the man seated halfway down the table. The man was a minor donor accustomed to having others yield to him, and he made a remark, not loudly, but the kind of remark people use only with someone they believe will never be able to answer them. The waitress lowered her head, murmured an apology, and began wiping hurriedly with the cloth draped over her hand. Everyone around the table continued turning pages as though nothing had happened. Cosimo set down his pen. He didn't speak immediately. He simply looked up at the other man, directly, without anger or harshness, and held his gaze long enough for the rustle of turning pages around the table to grow sparse and then disappear, long enough for the man himself to stop moving and begin sitting straighter without understanding why he was doing it. Then Cosimo said, in the most ordinary voice in the world, that he believed it was time to apologize to her. No one in the room breathed. The man opened his mouth to say something, then looked around and realized that no one intended to help him, and finally turned toward the waitress and apologized, awkwardly, with both hands resting on the table. She stood motionless, uncertain how to respond, because in all the time she'd worked there, no one had ever apologized to her for anything. Cosimo gave her a slight nod, thanked her for bringing the water, then picked up his pen and resumed. As everyone began standing and gathering their papers, Aurelio Marchetti walked around the table, bent close to Cosimo's ear, and said very quietly that there were several people in the lobby he recognized, that they weren't hotel guests, and that someone had been discreetly comparing the fundraising gala's guest list with another list that morning. Cosimo's expression didn't change. He merely looked toward the walnut door, which remained partly open after the waitress had pushed the beverage cart into the hallway, then nodded and said nothing more. The main elevator was under maintenance, so she had been directed to the service elevator in the rear, a narrow one that smelled of cardboard and floor cleaner, and when its doors opened on the 3rd floor, Imani stepped into a marble hallway so wide that even the sound of her own shoes seemed out of place. She set the violin case down for a moment to change hands, raised her eyes to look for the room number, and that was when Roy Kessler saw her from the far end of the hallway. He didn't need to think. Inside his mind, the story had already written itself before he took his first step. A young woman in a gray turtleneck and a brown coat worn thin at the cuffs, standing alone on the event floor, holding a case large enough to conceal almost anything, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and wooden doors among which she clearly didn't belong. He walked toward her, his shoes striking the stone, and ordered her to stand still. Imani stopped. She said she was looking for Grand Hall 302, speaking in the calm voice of someone who had learned very early that raising her voice had never saved anyone like her. Kessler asked how she'd reached the floor, and she answered that she'd taken the service elevator because the main one was being repaired. He asked who had authorized her to use it, and she said the person at the front desk downstairs had directed her there, and he gave a short laugh through his nose as though he'd heard something terribly amusing. He told her to open the case. Imani said he had the wrong person. She said she'd been invited, that the invitation was in the inside pocket of her coat, and she lifted her hand toward her chest to retrieve it. Kessler caught her wrist before she could reach it. He tightened his grip and forced her hand down, then said she wasn't allowed to reach inside her clothing in front of an officer, that people with honest intentions never did such things. Imani looked down at the hand gripping her wrist, then raised her eyes to his face, and said very slowly that he'd just told her to produce her papers, then refused to allow her to retrieve them, and she asked how he expected her to comply. He told her to lose the attitude. Then he spoke the sentence he'd used on so many people throughout all those years, that people with nothing to hide never became upset when they were searched, and he said it with the satisfaction of a man who had finished setting a trap in which every way out led back inside. Behind her, several dozen paces away, a walnut door stood partly open. Imani had seen it the moment she stepped out of the elevator. She knew exactly who was sitting behind that door, in the chair closest to the exit as he always sat, and she knew that if she spoke a single name, all of this would end within seconds. The man before her would turn pale. He would release her. He would step backward and begin saying the things she'd heard others say throughout her life. All she had to do was open her mouth. But that morning, while she'd been waiting downstairs in the lobby for her turn, she'd noticed two men standing beside the reception desk, carrying no luggage, asking for no room, simply holding a file and quietly watching everyone who passed through the doors. She'd lived beside her husband long enough to know what men like that looked like, and she knew that if his name was spoken in this hallway, it wouldn't merely save her, it would be recorded. It would be written on some document beside the date, the location, and her name, and it would become the first thread anyone needed to unravel everything her husband had spent 5 years concealing, not because he was ashamed, but because he'd sworn that his wife and son would never become anyone's targets. 5 years without looking at each other in public. 5 years traveling in separate cars. All of it in exchange for allowing her to live like an ordinary woman and her son to grow up without anyone knowing whose child he was. She'd paid that price every day, and she wouldn't spend it here, in a hotel hallway, merely to make one man stop squeezing her wrist. So she remained silent. She pulled her hand free, straightened, and said one final time that he had the wrong person, that she would remain exactly where she was, and he could call someone from the hotel to verify her identity. Kessler studied her for a long moment. Then he bent down and placed his hand on the violin case. When Imani reached down to protect it, Kessler's open palm struck across her face with a sound that cracked down the hallway. The violin case hit the floor, its strings crying out one broken note, and she stumbled back, bringing 2 fingers to the corner of her mouth where blood appeared. Sergeant Roy Kessler straightened up, breathing hard, his palm still burning. Behind her, the heavy walnut doors of Grand Hall 302 swung open from the inside. Cosimo Santangelo ran 3 steps into the hallway and stopped. Something crossed his face and shut down behind his eyes. He went down on one knee on the marble, lifted the violin case upright with both hands, the way a man lifts a sleeping child. He took the handkerchief from his breast pocket and held it out, and she took it the way people take something they've been handed 100 times before. Then he stood and turned to the sergeant. Kessler laughed, a nervous reflex of a man used to getting his way, and tried to say she had just come up in the service elevator, that someone was missing a bracelet above, and that Santangelo should go back inside and let him handle it. His laughter hadn't completely faded when Aurelio Marchetti stepped into the hallway behind them. The old man stopped at the threshold, took 3 steps forward, bowed his head, and said, "Mrs. Santangelo, are you all right?" The laughter stopped at once. The 3rd floor grew so quiet that the ventilation system could be heard running overhead. Cosimo looked Kessler straight in the eye and said in the flattest voice anyone there had ever heard, "You hit my wife." Then he turned to her and asked, "What do you want me to do?" Aurelio, standing 1 step away, heard those words and immediately lowered his eyes to the floor, because he'd walked beside this man since before Cosimo occupied the chair at the head of the table, and in all those years, he'd never once heard him ask anyone that question. No one told Cosimo Santangelo what to do. He was the man who gave answers, not the man who asked questions. But now he stood in the middle of a hotel hallway, with a dozen pairs of eyes fixed on him, waiting, truly waiting, for the answer of the woman in the brown coat worn thin at the cuffs. Imani lowered the handkerchief. She looked at him for a long time, and in that moment, she understood exactly what his question meant. It wasn't an offer of comfort. It was an open door. And behind that door waited all the things she'd spent her entire life refusing to let herself touch. Things that could make the man who'd just squeezed her wrist disappear from the city before nightfall without anyone troubling to ask where he'd gone. She knew her husband well enough to understand that if she asked for that, he would do it. Without hesitation. Without asking a second time. Her gaze moved past his shoulder toward the stairwell, where someone was running upward. Then she looked at him again and said, "Call the real police." Cosimo remained still. Something passed through his eyes, very quickly. Then he nodded once. And he didn't ask again. The man running up the stairs was Walter Pruitt, the hotel's director of security, a gray-haired man who had worked in that building longer than Kessler had worn his uniform. He reached them out of breath, understood the entire situation in the time it took him to study 3 faces, then stepped between Kessler and everyone else and told the sergeant to follow him downstairs. Kessler began to speak. He talked about the service elevator, the bracelet, and the way she'd behaved, his voice growing faster and higher with every sentence, while Pruitt simply stood there until he'd finished and repeated exactly what he'd said before. "Please come with me, Sergeant." Behind them, Cosimo bent down, picked up the paper invitation that had fallen from the front of his wife's coat, brushed it clean, and handed it back to her. They were taken to a small waiting room at the end of the hallway, the kind reserved for speakers before they went on stage, and Pruitt summoned the hotel's duty nurse. Imani sat on the edge of a chair, still holding the handkerchief, and said she was fine. Cosimo didn't argue with her. He laid the violin case on the low table, released the 2 tarnished brass clasps, and opened the lid to see whether the instrument had been damaged when it struck the stone floor. The neck was unharmed. The body was unharmed. He ran his hand along the strings, checked the bridge, then reached into the compartment underneath where the rosin and cleaning cloth were kept, and his fingers touched a stack of papers folded in half. He pulled them out. They weren't sheet music. The top page was a supplemental insurance application, already printed and almost completely filled in by hand, with only the signature field and the amount of the first payment left blank. Beneath it was an application for help with hospital expenses that had been stamped denied. And below that was another, thinner sheet bearing their son's name and a line stating that he was on the waiting list. Cosimo sat down very slowly. He began reading again from the first page, this time studying every line carefully, and the only sound in that small room was the rustle of paper. Then he looked up and asked his wife why she'd brought the violin there. Imani didn't answer immediately. She looked at the open case, then at the papers in her husband's hands, and finally said the organizers had agreed to buy it from her. Not for the auction. Not as a donation. They'd examined the violin the previous week, had it appraised, and arranged for her to come to the room that morning to sign the papers and receive the money. She spoke in a calm voice without a trace of self-pity, as though she were announcing a train schedule. And it was that very calmness that made it difficult for the man opposite her to breathe. He asked why. He asked why she hadn't told him. Imani merely raised her hand and pointed toward the insurance application he was holding. That policy, she said, wasn't something that could be obtained simply by offering money. It accepted only applicants with formal employment contracts, and it required proof of every source of income, with bank statements, pay stubs, and the employer's name. The place on the waiting list was the same. No one could buy it. People were placed in order, and that order didn't care who was rich or poor. But to keep that place, to prevent their son's application from being removed because he lacked supplemental insurance, she needed one exact sum of money, and that money had to be hers, money whose origin could be accounted for from beginning to end. She said that if money entered her account, and she couldn't explain where it came from, the application would be sent to the review department, and everything would stop there. She said she'd asked many times in many places, and the answer had always been the same. Cosimo placed the papers on the table. He remained silent for a long time. In all his years, this man had never encountered a door he couldn't find a way to open. He'd paid for access to rooms others weren't permitted to enter, rebuilt things others considered damaged beyond repair, and fully funded the fundraising gala being prepared outside without allowing anyone to mention his name. Yet everything he possessed, all of it combined, couldn't purchase a single line of text on a printed form for his own son. His money was useless. He raised his hand, touched the edge of the application, then drew it back. Imani saw him do it. She said softly that she'd intended to sign the papers and go home, that she'd calculated everything, and that she hadn't wanted him to learn about this on a morning when he had work to do. Cosimo looked up at her and asked whether she'd truly intended to sell her mother's violin, then go home and cook dinner as though nothing had happened. Imani didn't answer. She merely reached out and closed the lid of the violin case, while downstairs in the lobby, they had already begun laying the tablecloths for the evening. The security room at the Ambrose Hotel was in the basement, without windows, containing only a wall of monitors and the smell of machinery running day and night. Kessler had been taken into the adjoining room, and the door had been closed behind him. Only Cosimo, Aurelio, and Walter Pruitt remained here, and Aurelio spoke first. The old man didn't waste time. He said he'd made several calls, that the sergeant owed money in a place where men like him should never owe money, that he owned a house purchased with funds no one had ever questioned, and that with a single telephone call, he would pack his belongings, leave the city that very evening, and no one would ever hear his name mentioned again. Aurelio said it in the voice of a man explaining an administrative procedure, because in the world where he'd spent his entire life, that was exactly what it was. He added that this wasn't about revenge. It was about closing a door before someone else looked through it, and if they allowed this matter to follow its natural course, by the end of the week, Mrs. Santangelo's name would be sitting on the desks of people from whom they'd spent years concealing the fact that she even existed. Cosimo didn't answer. He stood with his back to them, looking at the wall of monitors, and remained that way long enough for Pruitt to begin feeling uncomfortable. On those screens, the hotel continued operating as though nothing had happened. People carried flowers into the lobby. People arranged chairs. In a small image near the upper corner, the third-floor hallway could be seen completely empty now, with only the marble floor reflecting the light. At last, Cosimo turned around and said no. Aurelio asked him again, not because he hadn't heard clearly, but because in all those years, he'd never heard that answer given in a situation like this. Cosimo said that if he handled it the other way, then someday, when his son was old enough to ask what had happened to the man at the hotel that morning, he would have to choose between lying to his child or telling him that his father's way of solving problems was to make people disappear. He said he'd grown up with exactly that answer, that his own father had never lied to him, and that it had taken him many years to understand the price of knowing such truths when he was far too young. He said he didn't want the boy to inherit that legacy. Then he added more quietly that his wife had stood in the hallway that morning and made her own choice. She'd told him to call the real police, and he wouldn't go against her choice merely because he had another way that was faster. Aurelio sat down, rested both hands on his knees, and said nothing more. Pruitt broke the silence. He said there was something they needed to know. Until the previous spring, the third-floor hallway had still used the old security system, with blurred images and no sound, which was why a man like Kessler could believe that area was safe. But the hotel had replaced the entire system. It now recorded sound clearly enough to capture a person's breathing. Everything that had happened in that hallway that morning was stored on the hard drives in this room. After Pruitt finished speaking, he looked at Cosimo, and he held that gaze for a long time, because he'd worked in that building long enough to know which company had installed the new system, to know the name printed on the contract, and to know where that name would lead if anyone took the trouble to follow it. He said plainly that the recording would save Mrs. Santangelo, and it would also point directly to Cosimo. Aurelio looked up sharply and began saying that this would reopen the very door Cosimo's father had spent his life closing, that once one installation company was dragged into the light, 3 more would follow, then 4 more. Cosimo listened until he'd finished. Then he turned to Pruitt and asked what he intended to do with the recording. Pruitt answered that under regulations, he was required to submit it to the investigating authorities within 24 hours. Cosimo nodded. He didn't tell Pruitt not to submit it. He didn't ask for a copy. He didn't say another word. He simply picked up his coat, thanked him, and walked toward the door. And his decision not to stop it was the most costly thing he'd done that day. By Monday morning, the police union had issued a statement. It was brief, written in language polished smooth by years of use, saying that the organization stood behind its members while the incident was being reviewed, that the public should wait for all the facts before reaching a conclusion, and that an officer forced to make a decision in a fraction of a second couldn't be judged through the eyes of someone able to replay the moment again and again. Not one word in the entire statement mentioned the woman who had been struck. That afternoon, things began moving online. First came a long article on a small news site no one had ever heard of, telling the story from an entirely different angle. It mentioned the missing diamond bracelet, mentioned that the woman had used the service elevator, and ended with a question asking whether a personal incident was being used to damage the reputation of the police. Then came a second article, then a third. By evening, the Sant'Angelo name had been added to the headlines, and by the following morning, social media was filled with posts so similar that reading 3 of them was enough to see they'd all been formed from the same mold. Every one of them revolved around a single claim, that the wife of a crime boss had staged the entire incident. People found old photographs of her somewhere. They discussed the coat she'd worn. Someone wrote that if she was truly married to that man, why did she need to use the service elevator? And that sentence was shared more times than all the others combined. Cosimo sat in his office in South Philadelphia and read everything from beginning to end. He didn't become angry in the way people might have expected. He read slowly, as though reviewing a contract, and what drew his attention wasn't the content, but the timing. He had everything printed on paper, arranged according to the time it had been posted, then spread across the long table, and he stood looking down at it. The first articles had appeared within the same narrow span of time, so close together that they couldn't have been written by people who had simply become angry at the same moment by chance. They shared several identical phrases. They cited one another in a closed circle. And the small news site that had published the first article had been created only recently and had posted only a few dozen stories, more than half of them about incidents involving police officers in the city. Cosimo summoned someone. The man arrived that afternoon, worked in the adjoining room, and by evening handed him a single sheet of paper. On it was the name of a media company registered in another state, and beneath that was the name of the entity that had paid it. Cosimo read the final line. Then he read it again. He sat for a long time with the paper in his hand, and the man waiting at the door saw no change in his expression. But Cosimo placed the sheet on the table the way someone sets down something that has just cut his hand. By the following morning, the 3 accounts that had begun the entire wave no longer existed. They hadn't been suspended. They were simply gone. The small news site ceased operating overnight, its homepage entirely blank, without a single line of explanation. The media company in the other state withdrew its license and dissolved through proper procedure, neatly, with every necessary signature, and its representative moved elsewhere for work. No one was hurt. No one knocked on anyone's door. No threat was spoken, and no explanation was offered to anyone. The remaining articles were still online, but no one was multiplying them anymore, and within a few days, they sank beneath other things, as everything eventually did. Aurelio arrived that evening and found Cosimo still sitting before the paper. The old man looked down, read it, and immediately understood why Cosimo hadn't become angry with the union, the press, or the people spreading lies online during the previous 2 days. None of them deserved his anger. The name on that final line didn't belong to an outsider. It belonged to someone inside the family. When Aurelio finished reading, he sat down and released a long breath, then spoke the name aloud, very softly, as though saying it any louder would make it true. Salvatore Ruffo. That evening, inside the 2-room apartment in North Philadelphia, nothing suggested that an entire city outside was talking about the boy's mother. Amari sat on the living room floor with his shoebox of toys open wide, arranging his plastic soldiers into a long line that stretched from the leg of the table to the edge of the rug. He worked with great seriousness, occasionally leaning back to inspect them, then adjusting one soldier so it stood perfectly straight. And whenever one fell and brought down an entire section with it, he burst into laughter, the bright, breathless laughter of a child that shook his whole body, then patiently stood them up one by one. Imani sat in the chair watching her son. She'd been home since the afternoon, had showered, cooked dinner, sat and eaten with him, and listened while he told her about which child in his kindergarten class had brought a new box of crayons. Throughout the evening, she laughed in all the places where laughter was expected and revealed nothing. There were certain skills people learned only when they had no other choice, and she'd learned them very early. At bedtime, the boy gathered all his plastic soldiers into the box, brushed his teeth, then climbed into bed and lay on his side in his familiar position, with one hand beneath his cheek. Imani pulled the blanket over him. She was about to rise when the boy called, "Mom?" She sat down again. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, then asked why he didn't have a father like Micah did. He asked in an ordinary voice, without sadness or blame, the voice of a child wondering about something he believed must have a simple explanation, the way a child might wonder why it rained. He said Micah's father came to pick him up from school, and Dele's father did too. Then he fell silent and waited for his mother to answer. Imani sat motionless. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was a true answer, But that answer was far too long to give a 5-year-old child before bedtime, and it involved too many people, too many promises, a document locked inside a safe in another state, and an entire Saturday morning that had just passed and that she would never tell her son about. So she reached out, smoothed his hair, and said there were things she would tell him completely when he was a little older. The boy nodded. He accepted the answer easily in the way only children could, then asked whether she had to leave early for work the next morning, and she said yes. She turned off the light, then she lay beside him on the small bed, wrapped one arm around his body, and began to sing softly. It was an old, slow song. She couldn't remember where or when she'd learned it, only that it had lived inside her mind since before any of the homes where she'd once stayed. And every time she sang it, the boy fell asleep. That night was no different. Before the second verse ended, his breathing had become even. Imani remained there in the darkness for a long while, listening to her son breathe, then gently withdrew her arm and rose. She walked into the outer room, went to the window, and drew the curtain aside by the width of her hand. Down below, across the street, beneath the second street lamp from the intersection, a dark car was parked. She'd noticed it at dusk. No lights were on inside. No one had left the car. No one had come upstairs. The doorbell hadn't rung once. Imani stood there looking down for a while, then released the curtain and went to bed. And when she left the building before dawn the next morning, the car was still exactly where it had been. The man came to the community center early Wednesday afternoon, just after Imani's music class had ended and all the children had gone home. He waited in the hallway until she'd finished stacking the chairs, then stepped inside, showed her his identification, and said his name was Curtis Holloway. He didn't raise his voice or block the doorway, and he asked whether she minded if he sat down. Imani said she didn't. Holloway placed a briefcase on the folding table in the middle of the room, opened it, and removed several sheets of paper. He spread them before her slowly, one at a time, in the manner of a man who had performed this gesture many times and knew exactly what effect it would have. The top page was the supplemental insurance application she still kept at home, or more precisely, a copy of it, complete down to every space she'd filled in by hand. The next page was the application for help with hospital expenses that had been denied. The final page listed the payments she'd made and the amounts still outstanding, including the line showing the date after which the application would be transferred to the review department. Holloway didn't explain the documents. He allowed her to look at them herself. Then he said he knew where she'd gone to ask for help, knew what answers she'd received, and even knew why she'd taken the violin to the hotel the previous Saturday morning. He said there was another way. The Federal Witness Protection Program, he explained, included full health insurance with no exclusions and no review of income sources, as well as relocation to another place under another name. He said everything in her son's file would be transferred into the federal system within a few weeks, and the date printed on that paper would no longer matter. Imani asked what he wanted. Holloway sat straighter and said he wanted her to sit down with his people for multiple interviews and tell them what she'd heard during the 5 years she'd lived in that house, who had visited, which names had been spoken, and what she'd seen that she might not even realize was important. He said she would testify, and in the same voice, he said that once everything was over, she would leave, and she wouldn't be allowed to make contact again. Not once, not ever. He said he understood how difficult that was. Then, he tapped one finger lightly against the paper bearing her son's name and said that sometimes people had to choose between two things they loved, and he was very sorry that she was one of those people being forced to choose. Imani stared at the papers spread across the folding table for a long time, long enough for Holloway to believe she was calculating her options. In truth, she was reading her son's name. It had been typed with the surname in capital letters, resting among lines she'd read so many times at night that she knew them by heart. And now it was here again, inside a music classroom that still smelled of chalk, on the table of a stranger. Then she reached out and pushed the entire stack back toward him. She said she'd lived through months when she had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying enough medicine, and she said it without complaint, merely stating something that had happened. She said she'd stood inside a pharmacy for a very long time, trying to calculate whether it would be all right to leave one thing out, but she said there had never been a day in her life when she'd been poor enough to trade her husband for a place on a waiting list. She said that if she did what he'd just proposed, her son would grow up healthy in another city under another name, and one day he would ask about his father, and she would have to look into his eyes and lie to him for the rest of her life. She said she wasn't strong enough to do that. Holloway remained silent for a moment, then nodded, gathered the papers, and before leaving, placed a business card on the table and said the offer would remain open if she changed her mind. Imani didn't touch the card. She sat for a while longer in the empty room, then locked the door, walked to the old car parked behind the building, took the driver's seat, and didn't start the engine. She remained there for a long time. Then she cried, the way someone cries after holding it back for far too long, both hands gripping the steering wheel while her body trembled in waves. And outside, the afternoon remained bright, and people continued passing along the sidewalk without anyone looking in. When she'd grown calmer, she opened the glove compartment and took out the handkerchief. It had been washed clean and folded neatly into a square, but one corner still bore a faint stain that wouldn't come out. She held it in her palm for a long while. She didn't use it to wipe her face. She only held it tightly, then folded it again, returned it to its place, and started the car. That same afternoon, not far away, Curtis Holloway sat in a conference room in South Philadelphia, across from Cosimo Santangelo and Aurelio Marchetti. He opened the same briefcase. This time, the papers he spread across the table concerned something entirely different. A list of companies, installation contracts, payments routed through 3 states, and at the very end, a sheet containing only 4 lines, each bearing one name. Holloway said he didn't care about those 4 names for any moral reason. He said he needed them only to open another door. Then he named his price. He said Mrs. Santangelo's name was now in the case file, that it had been there since Saturday, and was mentioned one more time with every passing day, and that if Cosimo gave him those 4 names, his wife's name would be removed from the file completely, as though it had never appeared there. He said it was a very good offer, and he was right. Cosimo studied the sheet with its 4 lines for a long time. He didn't ask why Holloway had approached him at that particular moment, nor did he ask whether the man sitting before him had made the same kind of offer to anyone else. He asked only one question: how long would his wife's name remain in the file if he refused? Holloway answered that it would remain there as long as the case stayed open. He closed his briefcase, stood, thanked them for their time, and said he would return. And so, during the same afternoon of an ordinary Wednesday in Philadelphia, a husband and wife at opposite ends of the city were each given an offer measured in the same thing. Neither knew the other had just been asked. And that evening, when they spoke on the telephone as they did every night, both of them said that nothing had happened that day. Late that afternoon, long after the final music class had ended, and only Imani and the security guard at the front desk remained in the center, Roy Kessler arrived. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He stood in the classroom doorway with both hands held before his stomach, and he looked strangely smaller than the man who had stood in the hotel hallway on Saturday morning. He asked for permission to speak for a few minutes. Imani didn't invite him to sit, but she didn't send him away either. Kessler spoke. He said he'd been suspended, that his badge and gun had been taken, that his wife had packed her belongings and gone to stay with her sister, and that his daughter hadn't answered his calls in 4 days. He said this was the only work he'd ever known, and now he didn't know what he was going to do. He said that morning he hadn't known who she was. Then he stopped and added that he was sorry, and his voice broke on the final word. Imani listened to everything. She allowed him to speak until he had nothing left to say, and she didn't interrupt once. Then she answered. She said he'd come there to show her that he was a human being too, that he had a wife, a child, and a life falling apart. She said she saw that now. She said she believed him. Then she said that the previous Saturday morning, when she'd stood in that hallway and told him 3 times that he had the wrong person, he hadn't given her the opportunity he was asking from her now. She said he hadn't given her even 1 minute to prove that she was a human being too. She spoke very softly, without bitterness, and that was what made the words so heavy. Kessler stood there, opened his mouth, then closed it again. Imani turned toward the door and called the security guard, then told Kessler that if he had anything more to say to her, he could say it somewhere with attorneys for both sides present. Kessler left. The guard followed him to the main entrance, then returned. Outside in the parking lot, darkness had begun to fall. Kessler walked toward his car and stopped. A brown envelope had been tucked beneath the windshield wiper. He looked around the parking lot. No one was there. He pulled it free, tore open the edge, and found only a single photograph inside. It had been taken from the street in daylight and showed a 2-story house with a white fence in the northern suburbs. The very house he'd purchased with money no one had ever asked him to explain. There was no letter, no writing, nothing at all. Roy Kessler stood in the middle of the parking lot for a long time with the photograph in his hand, and for the first time since Saturday morning, he was truly afraid. It took Imani 2 days to find him. The barbershop in Kensington was now an auto parts store, its old sign removed long ago, and someone directed her to a row of boarding houses several blocks away, where Otis Bramwell rented a room on the top floor and worked nights as a security guard at a warehouse near the Beltway. He opened the door that afternoon, his hair almost entirely gray, and when he recognized her, he froze at the threshold. Then he lowered his eyes. During the nearly an hour they spent sitting in that small room, he didn't look directly at her face even once. Imani said she'd been searching for him for a long time but hadn't known where to look. Otis said he hadn't wanted anyone to find him. He told her slowly, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, that one evening long ago, someone had stopped his car on the way home and ordered him to get out, and that afterward, they found something inside his vehicle that he swore before God he'd never seen before. He said he'd fought it. He said he'd fought for months, until his appointed attorney told him that if he accepted the charge, he would be released much sooner, and by then, his wife had stopped visiting, and the shop had been taken to settle his debts. He said the years he'd spent inside hadn't felt as long as the day he walked out and didn't know where to go. Then he added casually, the way old people sometimes did when remembering the past, that the girl who swept the floors had been in the shop that day too. The girl who worked afternoons, and the police had called her outside for questioning. He said he'd never blamed that girl for a single thing. She'd been too young. Of course she'd been afraid. Imani sat in silence. She said nothing. She lowered her eyes toward the cup of tea on the table, and after a while, she asked whether his back hurt from standing through the night shift. Otis said it wasn't too bad. The conversation moved to other things. Only near the end of the visit, when the sky had darkened, did Imani explain why she'd come. She told him what had happened at the hotel on Saturday morning, briefly and without embellishment, and said that the man standing in the hallway that day was the same man who had stood beside Otis's car all those years ago. Otis didn't seem surprised. He merely sank deeper into his chair and exhaled. Imani said the case was being reopened, that a federal prosecutor had taken it, and that if he agreed to testify, his words wouldn't fall into emptiness as they had before. Otis shook his head. He said he'd already spoken, had spoken many times, and no one had listened. He said all he wanted now was peace. That was when Imani reached across the table, placed her hand over his, and told him he'd never done anything wrong. She said it very slowly, then repeated it once more. Otis Bramwell sat motionless. Then his shoulders began to tremble, and the old man lowered his face and wept before the young woman to whom he'd given her first job when she was 18 years old, when she'd walked into his shop carrying one bag, and without a single name she could call upon for help. For a long while he couldn't speak. Then he nodded. He said, "All right, I'll go." There was a knock at the door. Imani opened it, and standing in the hallway was a young woman in plain clothes, holding a rigid envelope. Tessa Vaughn said she'd spent several days trying to find that address. She placed a small hard drive on the table, and beside it, a copy of an internal complaint bearing a receipt stamp from several months earlier. A complaint she'd submitted through the proper channels and had never received even one line in response to. She said the hard drive contained recordings she'd preserved from previous shifts, footage that should have been deleted. Otis asked who she was. Tessa remained silent for a long time. Then she said her father's name. She said he'd died several years earlier, that he was the man who had stood beside Kessler at Otis's car that night, and that his signature appeared beneath the statement that had sent Otis to prison. She said she'd learned the truth only after reading the old case file, and that she hadn't been able to sleep since. She said she hadn't come to ask for forgiveness, because she knew she had no right to ask. Otis Bramwell studied her for a long time, with the gaze of a man seeing the face of someone dead reflected in the face of that person's daughter. Then he told her to testify. He told her to say everything, then go home and live a decent, honorable life, and not leave the profession merely because she was ashamed. Then he added more softly that forgiveness was his decision to make, not hers. The Financial Review subpoena arrived the following week by mail, printed on federal letterhead. It required Imani to submit every document connected to the places she'd lived over the years, rental agreements, receipts, anything bearing her signature. Holloway had said he would return, and this was how he returned. Imani spent an entire evening sitting on the living room floor, with the cardboard box of documents she kept on top of the cabinet, pulling out each bundle and arranging them by year. She'd moved many times before coming to this apartment, and every move had added another stack of papers. Near midnight, when she reached the records for the first apartment where she'd lived after giving birth to her son, a page slipped out of the folder. It was a rental guarantee. It stated that the tenant's guarantor was a limited liability company with a name that sounded like a building materials supplier, registered in that same state, and beneath it was a handwritten signature. Imani stared at the page for a long time. She remembered that day clearly. She remembered preparing herself to be rejected because she had no one to serve as guarantor, no parents, no relatives, not a single name to write in that space. Then the broker had called to say her application had been approved, and she'd believed she'd been lucky. She'd believed that for all those years. The following morning, she gave the company's name to an acquaintance who worked in a notary office, and by the afternoon, she had an answer. The person who had signed was Renata Santangelo. 3 days later, Imani drove to the house in South Philadelphia that she'd entered exactly twice in her life. A housekeeper opened the door, led her through a hallway filled with photographs of people who had died, and brought her into the rear sitting room, where her mother-in-law sat in an armchair beside the window with a stack of letters in her lap. Renata Santangelo didn't rise. She merely looked up, studied Imani from head to toe in the way she always did, then returned to her letters. In 5 years, this woman had never once called Imani by name. She referred to her as she when speaking to her son and as you when forced to address her directly. Imani placed the rental guarantee on the small table between them and asked whether the signature was hers. Renata glanced down. She didn't pick it up, study it closely, or pretend to be surprised. She said yes. Imani asked why. The older woman sat in silence for a moment, one hand still resting on the stack of letters, then asked which answer Imani wanted, the kind one or the true one. Imani said she wanted the truth. Renata nodded once, as though someone had finally asked the right question. Then she said she'd never accepted the marriage, not then and not now, and she wouldn't sit there and lie about it. She said her son had broken something his father had spent his entire life building, and she'd known from the beginning that a day would come when the price had to be paid, and that day had arrived the previous Saturday morning in a hotel hallway. Only after saying that did she raise her eyes and look directly into Imani's face for the first time. Then she said that the child inside Imani at the time had been her grandchild. She said she didn't need to know who his mother was or what surname he would carry. He was still the blood of this family, and as long as she lived, no grandchild of hers would sleep in a place where someone could put him out on the street for want of a signature. She said she'd signed, then forgotten about it. Imani asked why she'd never told her. Renata lifted the stack of letters, placed it beside her, straightened the cloth across her knees, and said that signing a piece of paper didn't mean she'd changed her mind about Imani. She said the two things had nothing to do with each other. Then she said that if Imani had nothing else to ask, she had letters to read, and she lowered her head, and the conversation ended there. Imani rose, picked up the paper, and walked to the door. At the threshold, she turned back and thanked her. Renata didn't look up. The envelope was delivered to the office in South Philadelphia on Monday morning, without a stamp or postmark, with only his name handwritten across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the marriage certificate filed in Delaware many years earlier, bearing 2 names, a date, and the signature of the pastor from a small church Cosimo hadn't entered again since that day. In the lower corner, written in blue ink, was one line stating that the council would meet on Thursday. Cosimo studied the paper for a long time. Aurelio Marchetti stood beside him without speaking, because both men understood what it meant without needing an explanation. Before Cosimo's father was shot dead on the church steps, he'd left behind what people in the family called his directives, and the most burdensome of them was the rule that whoever occupied the chair at the head of the table had to marry within the families. Not because of affection, because a marriage to an outsider couldn't be controlled, and a wife without a family standing behind her had nothing to lose. And someone with nothing to lose was the most dangerous person in a room filled with secrets. Cosimo had broken that rule. He'd broken it inside a small church in another state, without guests, photographs, or an announcement. And throughout all those years, he'd kept that document silent inside a safe in Delaware. People had always believed he'd hidden his wife because he feared his enemies. That was only half the truth. The other half was that, as long as no one saw that document, no one could place it on the meeting table. Then, on Saturday morning, in a marble hallway, he'd stood before a police sergeant and spoken 3 words. He'd known exactly what he was doing. He'd known those words would be heard by the guests who had just stepped out of the elevator, by the employee pushing the linen cart, by an entire hallway standing still. He'd known that from that moment forward, the safe in Delaware would no longer matter. He'd spoken anyway, and now the only weapon capable of bringing him down lay on the table, handed over by his own hand, and someone had picked it up. That evening, Cosimo placed a telephone call. At the other end was the man overseeing the group waiting outside the 2-story house with the white fence in the northern suburbs, men who had been there since the previous evening and were still waiting for one sentence. Cosimo told them all to go home. He offered no explanation. The other man asked once more, and Cosimo merely repeated that they were all to go home, then ended the call. Afterward, he picked up his coat. The restaurant stood on a southern street corner, the kind of place where a man didn't need a reservation if he was the right man, and Salvatore Ruffo was seated at the innermost table with several others when Cosimo entered. Everyone at the table fell silent. Cosimo pulled out the chair opposite Salvatore and sat down. He didn't remove his coat. He didn't order anything. He placed the copy of the document on the tablecloth between a plate and a glass and left it there. Salvatore smiled and made several remarks about how long it had been since the two of them had sat together. Cosimo allowed him to finish. Then, in the level voice every person around that table had heard at least once in their life and never wanted to hear again, he said that Salvatore owned 4 restaurants, 2 yards in Camden, and a warehouse on Delaware Street. He said he knew all 7 addresses. Then he said those 7 addresses were the only ones he would ever touch, nothing more, not now or ever, and that Salvatore's father would understand why he was saying this, though Cosimo wasn't certain Salvatore would. He stood. He didn't take the document with him. He left it on the table among the plates and walked toward the door, and no one in that restaurant managed to speak until the door had closed behind him. The following morning, the 2 yards in Camden changed ownership. The transaction passed neatly through 3 layers of companies and was completed before noon, with every signature and notarization in place, legal from beginning to end. No one was hurt. No one knocked on anyone's door. Salvatore Ruffo learned about it through a telephone call from his accountant, and after ending the call, he sat motionless in his office for a long time. Cosimo said nothing to anyone about it that morning. He merely asked Aurelio what time the council would meet on Thursday. Thursday morning was foggy, and on the drive from South Philadelphia to the house where the council always met, Aurelio Marchetti sat beside Cosimo in the back seat and remained silent for nearly half the journey. Then he spoke, and the first thing he said was a request for the car to stop for a moment. The vehicle pulled to the curb beside a row of red brick buildings whose shops hadn't yet opened. Aurelio stared straight ahead, with both hands resting on the leather briefcase in his lap, and said that he was the person who had given Salvatore the copy of the document. Cosimo didn't turn toward him. He said nothing. Aurelio continued in the even voice of a man reciting a statement he'd rehearsed inside his mind for many nights. He said he was the only person besides the husband and wife who knew exactly where the record was kept, that he'd personally handled the paperwork in Delaware that day, and that he'd also been the one who advised Cosimo to keep everything secret from the beginning. He said he'd spent the entire previous winter thinking. He said he'd stood beside Cosimo's father until that final morning, had witnessed what happened on the church steps, and hadn't slept through a single night since. Then he spoke the truest thing of all. He said he hadn't done it for money, and Salvatore had never promised him a single dollar. He'd done it because he believed that if Cosimo were removed from that chair, Aurelio would be allowed to live out the rest of his life, while if Cosimo remained, sooner or later Aurelio would find himself standing on some other set of steps. He said he'd been afraid. He said he was old now, and that fear was the only thing he had left. Then Aurelio Marchetti lowered his head and wept without making a sound, his shoulders trembling, an old man in a carefully tailored coat, sitting inside a car on a foggy morning. Cosimo listened to everything. He didn't interrupt once, ask Aurelio to repeat himself, or strike the seat with his hand. When Aurelio fell silent, Cosimo waited another moment, then said very softly that he should go home. He said no one would touch him. He said, "I won't allow anyone to touch you." Then he told the driver to open the door. Aurelio stepped onto the sidewalk with his briefcase in hand, and remained there as the car drove away. The meeting room was long and located on the ground floor, its windows covered by heavy curtains, with a dark wooden table from the previous generation standing in the center. 11 people sat around it. Renata Santangelo occupied the chair at the opposite end in a black suit, one hand resting on the table, speaking to no one. Salvatore Ruffo began. He spoke briefly without raising his voice, produced the copy of the marriage certificate, and passed it from one person to the next. He repeated the rule everyone in the room knew by heart, that the man at the head had to marry within the families, that this wasn't Salvatore's opinion but the written command of the man now lying beneath the earth. He said they'd been deceived for all those years. He said the entire city knew now. The police knew. The federal authorities knew. And he asked the people around the table which of them felt secure knowing that a woman from outside the families had lived in the same house with everything they'd spoken about for 5 years. Papers rustled. Someone nodded. Cosimo sat in the chair closest to the door and didn't speak a single word in his own defense. Then the door behind him opened. The person opening it was Aurelio Marchetti. He stood there holding the door with both hands, neither entering nor looking at anyone in the room, and offered no explanation. The person who crossed the threshold was Imani Rowe. The entire room fell silent. Not one of the men seated around that table had ever seen her in person. She walked to the center of the room and stopped without sitting because no chair had been provided for her. She said she hadn't come to ask anyone for anything. She said she knew someone in that room had just called her a threat, and she understood why they believed that. Then she said what she'd come to say. She said that in all those years, she'd never taken a single dollar from that table. She gave them the name of the apartment she rented, the name of the bakery where she worked the early shift, and the name of the community center where she taught music to children. She said her son carried his mother's surname. She said she'd lived her entire life on what she'd earned herself, and would continue living that way, and that if their concern was that she might take something of theirs away, then she respectfully reminded them that she'd never accepted anything she could take. Then she spoke her final sentence. She said the dangerous woman wasn't the one with nothing to lose. It was the woman forced to remain silent. No one answered. She stood there another moment, then stepped backward once, and remained still. And Renata Santangelo rose. She stood slowly, bracing one hand against the table, and looked around the room. Then she said she'd opposed this marriage longer than everyone present combined, and anyone who doubted it could ask her son. She said she wasn't standing because she'd changed her mind about the woman. She was standing because there was exactly one person in that room who had never taken anything from that table, and that person had just finished speaking. Then she cast her vote. After her vote, other hands rose one by one, and by the time the count was finished, Salvatore Ruffo remained seated with his expression unchanged. Though both hands now lay flat against the table, Cosimo had won. Then he stood. He thanked everyone and said that as of that day, he was leaving the chair. Chairs scraped against the floor. Someone demanded to know what he was saying. Cosimo said only that he'd promised someone he wouldn't make any decision on his own without asking her first, and that he couldn't keep that promise while continuing to sit there. Then he named the person he'd chosen to succeed him, a name no one had expected, and it wasn't Salvatore Ruffo. He fastened his coat, walked around the table, and reached the doorway, where Aurelio Marchetti remained holding the door open until the last person had passed through. The federal trial began on a morning late in the season, and the courtroom was already crowded before proceedings opened. Otis Bramwell sat in the middle row, wearing the old suit he'd taken from his closet for the first time in years. Tessa Vaughn sat 2 rows away, alone. In the final row against the wall, Cosimo Santangelo sat motionless without a bodyguard beside him, and throughout that morning, he didn't speak a word to anyone. Prosecutor Marguerite Okonjo began with the recording. The lights were dimmed. The screen showed the marble hallway on the 3rd floor, clear enough to reveal the chandeliers reflected in the floor, and there was sound. The entire courtroom listened from beginning to end. They heard the woman say 3 times that he had the wrong person. They heard her say the invitation was in her pocket. They heard the sergeant's voice, one sentence after another, all the way to the final words. Then they heard the violin strike the stone floor, and that broken note rang through the courtroom speakers. When the lights came back on, no one moved. Someone in the rear row drew in a sharp breath, then held it. Okonjo offered no commentary on the recording. She merely presented the next document, an internal report from the Ambrose Hotel prepared that same Saturday afternoon, stating that the diamond bracelet had been found inside the safe in the guest's own room, where she'd placed it herself and forgotten it. The report bore the shift supervisor's signature, the time, and the date. Okonjo read that section aloud, then placed the paper down and said there had never been a theft, and that this document had remained in the hotel's internal files from that day until now, without anyone disclosing it. A murmur rose at the back of the courtroom, then vanished the moment the judge struck the gavel. When it was Roy Kessler's turn, his attorney advised him not to speak at length. He didn't listen. He stood and began explaining, talking about the pressure of the shift, management's instruction to handle the matter discreetly, the service elevator, and the large case. Then he said it. He said she hadn't looked like someone who belonged there. After speaking those words, he stopped on his own, because the moment they left his mouth, even he heard them, and the attorney beside him closed his eyes. The courtroom fell silent with the kind of silence heard only when a man has just pronounced his own sentence. When Imani Rowe was called, she walked to the witness stand, took the oath, and sat down. She hadn't used makeup to conceal the small scar at the corner of her mouth. Okonjo asked whether the morning at the hotel had been the first time she'd met the defendant. Imani said no, briefly, without adding a single unnecessary word. She explained that many years earlier, she'd worked afternoons at a barbershop in Kensington, sweeping floors and washing towels, that on the night the shop's owner was stopped in his car, the police had called her outside for questioning, and that she'd been 18 years old, and so frightened she'd said she hadn't seen anything. Then she pointed toward the defense table, and said the man who had taken her statement that night was sitting right there. In the middle row, Otis Bramwell raised one hand to cover his mouth. Then Okonjo asked why she'd taken the violin to the Ambrose Hotel that morning. Imani remained silent for a moment. Then she said the violin had belonged to her mother. She said her mother had died when Imani was still young, died from a heart condition, the same condition for which her son was now waiting to receive treatment. And she said her family hadn't had insurance then, and people had told her mother to go home, rest, and decide what to do later. She said her mother had worked cleaning hotel rooms. Then she named the hotel. For the second time that morning, the entire courtroom fell silent. She said the violin had belonged to a guest who left it behind in a room many years earlier and never returned to claim it. And eventually, management told her mother to take it home and keep it. She said her mother couldn't play a single note. She had only kept it, cleaned it, and told her daughter it was the most valuable thing their family owned. Imani said she'd carried it with her ever since, through 4 homes. Through the year she turned 18 and walked out carrying a single bag, and that when it cracked, she'd repaired it herself with glue bought from a neighborhood store because she couldn't afford to have it professionally restored. Then she said that on that Saturday morning, she'd carried the same violin back into the building where her mother had cleaned rooms so she could sell it and exchange it for a place on a document for her son. She stopped. No one in the courtroom said anything. Then she looked straight ahead and spoke her final words, saying that for months, everyone had told her she'd been lucky because someone had been sitting behind a nearby door that day. She said she agreed. She had been lucky. Then she said that if a person had to be lucky before they were treated as a human being, then what was broken here wasn't merely one person. The defense attorney rose to begin his questioning. He picked up his notes, looked down at them, then looked at the woman seated on the witness stand, and finally toward the jury. He stood that way for several seconds. Then he placed his notes on the table, said the defense had no questions, and sat down. The jury didn't need much time. Roy Kessler was convicted on nearly every charge brought by the prosecution, from assault under color of authority and deprivation of civil rights to perjury and destruction of evidence, and he received a federal sentence of many years without the possibility of early release. When the sentence was read, he said nothing. He merely stood there with his shoulders sagging, and when he was escorted from the courtroom, he didn't turn back to look at anyone. That same week, Otis Bramwell's petition for a new trial was accepted for review. He received the news by telephone while working the night shift at the warehouse, and he had to sit down on a wooden crate in the yard to hear everything. Then he remained there for a long time beneath the high security lights without calling anyone, because he suddenly realized there was no one left for him to call. As for Cosimo Santangelo, what had begun with the recording from the third-floor hallway followed exactly the path Aurelio had warned about. Investigators traced the installation contract, then followed it to other companies, and by the end of the season, the prosecution presented him with a plea agreement. He accepted financial charges, received several years of probation, and was prohibited from holding any executive position in any business during that period. His attorneys had prepared 3 different approaches to negotiation. Cosimo used none of them. He read the agreement from beginning to end, picked up the pen, and signed without arguing over a single sentence. When he left the building, he told his attorney only that he'd paid with what should have been used to pay, and he never spoke of it again, not that day or at any time afterward. 6 months passed. In North Philadelphia, on the same street Imani walked every morning, a new sign was raised on an afternoon in May. The community music school bore her mother's name, offered free admission to children living with foster families, and enrolled more than 40 children during its first week. After his old conviction was formally overturned, Otis Bramwell accepted a position managing the facility. He arrived before everyone else and left after the last person had gone, repaired the door hinges and unsteady chairs with his own hands, and knew every child's name within a few weeks. Tessa Vaughn submitted her resignation from the department immediately after the trial. She now taught at a training academy, and her subject was professional ethics. During her first class, she told the trainees about an internal complaint submitted through the proper channels that no one had ever answered. Imani learned about the building only one afternoon, while reviewing the rental documents with the community center's volunteer accountant. The accountant asked why the rent there hadn't increased once in all those years, when every other property on the block had raised its rent 3 times. Then she showed Imani the name of the company that owned the building. It was a limited liability company with a perfectly ordinary-sounding name, which had purchased the property many years earlier just as the former owner was preparing to sell it to a real estate developer. And the only condition attached to the contract was that the community center's rent would remain unchanged. Imani sat for a long time with the paper in her hands. She didn't ask her husband about it, not that day or in the days that followed. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. The children's first performance took place on a Saturday evening. Extra chairs filled the center's large room. The windows were open to the street, and people had to stand in the rear hallway. Amari sat in the front row, healthy, his legs swinging without touching the floor. His shoebox of plastic soldiers held tightly in his arms because he'd insisted on bringing it, and every time one of his friends finished playing, he applauded more loudly than anyone in the room, then turned and smiled at the person beside him. Imani stood in the wings, with one hand holding the curtain, looking down. When the final performance ended, she stepped onto the stage to thank everyone, and that was when she saw him. Cosimo Santangelo sat in the last row against the wall. No one was with him. He wasn't wearing his 3-piece suit, only an ordinary coat, and he leaned slightly forward so he could see the boy in the front row more clearly. In 5 years, the two of them had never once looked at each other in the presence of other people. That evening, in the middle of a crowded room, Imani looked directly at him, and he raised his eyes to meet hers, and neither of them hurried to look away. He lifted one hand to his chest, touched the place where his coat pocket rested, then lowered it again. Inside that pocket was the same handkerchief from that day, washed clean long ago and folded neatly into a square, with a faint stain still remaining in one corner that would never come out. Some stories don't end with the wrongdoer being punished. They end with an ordinary person being given back the dignity that no one should ever have been permitted to take away. A person's dignity isn't determined by the clothes they wear, the place they emerge from, or whom they know. And at least once in life, every one of us will stand behind a door and hear something wrong happening on the other side, and what defines us is whether we choose to step through. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that more meaningful stories can reach more people every day. How do you feel about Imani's journey? And what would you have done if you had been standing in that hallway? Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we sincerely want to hear what comes from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, happiness, and peace in each day of your life. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.